Good morning and good afternoon, everyone.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a new episode with you. We've got a deep dive on AB5, and I am really excited to share this with you. I've got to be honest, it is dense. So I went through a lot to simplify it, and you'll notice this at some points, but this is really important. So I am excited about this. If you forgot, this week, my name is Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Business Development at Supply Chain Solutions. The lovely voice you heard earlier is Vanessa Fry. She's our Director of Marketing, and I promise you, we would not be able to make this show happen without her. We actually had a week where she was unable to join us, and it was a ship show. Let's put it that way. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us. As usual, I'd like to spend a moment to just take a second to respect some of the issues that the people of Ukraine have been facing as they really struggle to deal with the ongoing conflict. Thank you, everyone. All right, so as I mentioned, today's show is all about this newish legislation called AB5, and it literally caused the port of Oakland in California to shut down, and actually also caused the ports of LA and Long Beach to shut down. But that was the day before my wedding, so I was a little preoccupied at the moment. But my goal here today is for all of you to leave the show knowing a few things. First, what is AB5 and where did it come from? Second, what's the big deal? Third, why are truck drivers protesting it? And fourth and finally, and this is a little different, but what to expect from this. And I've got some interesting lines I'm going to share with you from a couple trucking associations, but recommendations. And it's a little bleak, but anyway, we'll get to that when we get to that. So I'm going to warn you, and I mentioned this earlier, I really had to simplify this because I read through around 4 to 5 Supreme Court briefs just to get an idea of what was going on. And while that was definitely overkill and really not necessary in the long run, it did feel the whole time like I was reading the fine print in contracts for hours. So I hope today that I can make it a little bit more digestible, but mainly a little bit more interesting. So AB5. It's more technically called California's Assembly Bill 5. It's also referred to as the Gig Worker Bill. And it's most simply put, it's difficult to simply put it, but hear me out. It's a California state statute, and it's an addition to the California Labor Code. And it changes the necessary requirements to claim an individual as an independent contractor versus an employee. And then another critical change is, and you really need to keep this in mind, is it puts the burden of responsibility on the employer to ensure they aren't entering into an employment agreement that could be considered a violation with this new code. The bill was actually signed back into law September of 2019, and it took effect actually before the pandemic began, January of 2020. So I'm going to pause real quick because I found that really interesting that this law's been around for such a long time. And also when you learn more about some of the feeder cases, or we can call it, like, there's one in particular, the impetus case, I'll call it, that this whole AB5 creation and implementation was around, it was actually the actions of a single last mile freight company. But yet here we are in 2022, and we're just starting to see the major protests and the effects around this in the trucking industry at large. Found that very interesting. So before I focus on that delay in time and some of the effects that you're going to see, let's quick dive into how we got to this point in California. So before the 1990s, there was a pretty simple determination of what was required to classify a worker as an independent contractor. And essentially, that was answering the question, what degree of control over the details of work being performed does the worker have? So there, as there generally are, were a lot of cases that challenged this over the years. But the first one that really made an effect on how workers were classified was actually a case back in 1989. So it was a California farming company that went by the name of S.G. Barillo and Sons, and they were brought into question on how they handled the compensation of their 50 workers. So a deputy labor commissioner issued a stop order and a penalty assessment against this company, S.G. Barillo and Sons, after another nearby cucumber harvester filed a complaint against them, which essentially read, hey, we're unable to compete with Barillo because he's unfairly compensating his workers. So After this kind of went to the legal turmoil, it got brought up all the way to the California Supreme Court, which concluded, yes, Barillo was unfairly compensating his employees. So a quick rundown of what happened. Barillo admitted the failure to secure a base hourly pay, but stated that the workers were independent contractors because of a share farmer agreement. And under this agreement, Barillo argued that the workers, they managed their own labor, they shared in the profit, but they also shared in the loss of the crop. Supreme Court came back and said, hey, this type of manual labor, it didn't pass this control of work test, the old test. But they did admit that in the process of kind of evaluating this, the current system of making this determination, in their own words, it couldn't be applied rigidly and in isolation. So as a result, it wasn't a complete enough method for really making these decisions, going forward. They viewed this as. As a result, they basically laid out 8 criteria, and they needed to be considered. And I'll quick give you a run through them word for word fast, so you have an idea, because this is actually still in effect today. This is the groundwork of what a lot of situations are still affected or rated by in California if it isn't under the AB5. So 8. First, whether the worker is engaged in a distinct occupation or business. Second, whether the type of work is usually done at the direction of a principal. Third, the level of skill required to perform the occupation in question. 4, whether the hiring entity or worker provides the place of work, instrumentalities, or tools to do the work. 5, the length of time in which the services are performed. 6, whether the worker is paid by time or by job. 7, whether the work is part of the usual course of business for the hiring entity. And then 8, and finally, whether or not the parties believe that the relationship is one of an employer-employee. So this kind of was the groundwork that was formulated from this case, and it stayed that way all the way up to 2005. So if you fast forward to 2005, this is really where the beginnings of the current AB5 reside. And it all started with this guy named Charles Lee. So a little bit of backstory. Nationwide same-day delivery company. They were called Dynamex. They had customers as large as Home Depot and also as small as non-business owning individuals. They hired Charles, or more accurately, as they stated, they entered a written agreement with Charles, and it lasted 15 days. 3 months later, April 15th, 2005, Charles filed a class action suit against Dynamex, claiming that the company was misclassifying their employees. So to kind of understand what that equals, really a class action suit, the court needs to determine a concept called commonality, and they need to make sure commonality exists. Basically, that means, hey, there's other people in the same situation and they feel the same way as you. What's difficult about this is it takes a long time to determine it. The court essentially has to survey a bunch of individuals. They've got to pick a time frame. They've got to have all these presets in determining, hey, what's a relevant time frame and what people can be included, can't be included, and are these answers correct or incorrect? Very lengthy, and I'm going to call this the legal turbine because stuff starts happening behind the scenes. It takes forever. So long story short, years later, commonality was determined to exist, but this was just part of this legal battle. And this is kind of where things get incredibly complicated and intertwined. So the best way to view this is just to zoom out, touch on some of the highlights, and just to make sure you understand the current determination. So, case started in 2005. The final ruling wasn't handed down until 2018. That was by the Supreme Court of California, and they found Dynamex had unlawfully deprived its workers fair compensation and benefits. Now, there was a little case that sneaked into this legal process. It had a huge effect on its outcome, and that was a case in 2010. It was Martinez versus Combs, and it just given a bullet point of the most important thing to note about that case was it changed the way courts defined the word employ. And because of this, and in making those changes, really what that Martinez versus Combs case did is it laid the groundwork for what is now currently AB5. And that groundwork was a modified version of that breakdown, which is now called the ABC test. So this is very important. This is actually what is affecting most independent contractors in California today. I'm going to read it word for word for you. So the ABC test goes as follows. It's a worker is free from control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with the performance of the work, both under the contract for the performance of the work and in the fact. And then B, that the worker performs work that is outside of the usual course of the hiring entity's business. And then C, that the worker is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as the work performed. Okay, I can send that out. That was probably the best, easiest to read stuff when I was going through all this. That was probably the cleanest, but still, I'm stumbling. Anyways, so I want to keep the zoomed out approach. So Dynamex is considered in the wrong. They've got to change their relationship with their drivers. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, California's legislator is churning. And they're working on taking this newly developed ABC test and making it into a statute. So later, that statute is going to be called AB5. But more notably than that ABC test, which is put into that statute, is that thing I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's the fact that they're switching the norm, essentially making everyone an employee first, unless proven otherwise by the employer. And that last part is huge, because flipping the norm is essentially putting responsibility on the employer to ensure that when they're considering having an independent contractor, they're doing so legally. Or if you currently have any independent contractors, that they are not currently in violation. And that's a massive burden, and that's also a massive risk if you are currently employing independent contractors. And this is really why the law had such a sweeping effect, and why the trucking industry is really in the crosshairs, because of all these owner-operator drivers, and the way they have those engagements does not line up well with the ABC test. So if you were operating in California as an independent contractor, essentially now, with the passing of AB5, you're up for review. And a failure to do so results in the potential for substantial penalties. So this is kind of where you have to go back. Like, why is this happening now? And quite frankly, it's really basic. And when you think about why is this happening now, there was a whole bunch of things that happened right after the law took effect. But why is this affecting truckers now? So pretty simply, you can imagine the trucking associations had a field day with this, and they did not want this to go into effect. They had a bunch of countersuits. They had a bunch of situations they brought up for, questioning the legality of it. And because of all of this, and because of all the legal challenges, there was a federal injunction that was put in place. And it essentially prevented that law from affecting all of the sectors. And that, unfortunately, the bad news is ended just last month. So the sad bottom line of this, as shippers or as truckers or a trucking company, you are going to be affected by this, at least in the short term. So this is kind of where I think it's almost comical, but it's pretty interesting. So because of this, a lot of these trucking associations started to put out some recommendations for, hey, if you're a trucker, you should do this. Hey, if you're a trucking company, you should do this. And they're so bad, it's comical. And this is, I think, a little bit because of how difficult this process has been and how unfairly the trucking companies felt like they've been treated. But I'm going to run through these because it's kind of crazy. So firstly, they recommend, if you're a trucking company, here's the 4 options that they think you should do. Number 1, cease doing business in California. The most drastic step, obviously, but essentially what they're saying is, if you're a trucking company taking this step, it's not desirable, but it's the surefire way to avoid any potential fines from AB5. Next, they said you can shift to a employer-employee model. So that's essentially the outcome of the bill. That's the goal of the AB5 bill, to create a labor environment which all full-time drivers are employees eligible for full-time benefits and worker compensation. Third, you could separate your brokerage business from your carrier business. So essentially, you'd create 2 distinct businesses, one which would imply drivers directly, and one which would serve brokerage or independent contractors with the authority to set their own rates and accept work elsewhere. That's a little bit complicated, but it essentially would be making sure that your drivers are truly independent contractors and they're not working for you, they're working for the market in general. And then 4 would be pursue an exemption. So there is a very narrow exemption crafted into the AB5 bill, and it's for independent contractors who provide services directly to contracting business rather than to customers of that business. But The issue here is that, in order to meet this exemption, it's just there's a lot of very specific requirements, and it for some reason doesn't seem very feasible, even though you could almost see it as feasible, but it really doesn't seem feasible for a lot of truckers in this situation, or trucking companies in this situation. So all of those are pretty drastic, but they also have equally drastic measures that they have for truckers themselves. So the first measure that they recommended for an actual trucker, if they wanted to avoid some of the penalties potentially associated with AB5, or didn't want to be in that employee-employer relationship, is number one, they can move out of California. So if they move out of California and they run more than 50% of their miles outside of the state, they don't have to worry about the effects of AB5. There are some caveats to that, though. So third, I'm going to skip to third because this is the caveat. Drivers can deadhead out of California. So essentially, they'll make a drop and then they're not going to make a pickup. And this is going to keep them a little bit exempt from some of those California labor laws, but it also is, principally against what we try to do as a supply chain company. We try to have, as least idle hours as possible. We try to have a trailer on a truck at all times. There's fees actually associated with that, particularly since, everything went awry with the pandemic. So let's go back to two. You can get an authority and change your status. So drivers can actually they can get their own operating authority and drive for a brokerage rather than drive as a leased owner operator. So yeah, that's kind of what the recommendations that these trucking associations put out. And you can see a lot of them are focused on, hey, go brokerage, or hey, get out of California. And that's tough. It's my final 2 cents really on this are, there's a lot of drastic things that, we saw coming, but they all came into effect very quickly. And, I think things based on, the potential for difficulties with this AB5 legislation, there are things that will change, but unfortunately, we got to give it time. This is, we just stirred up all the dust. And, there's already been really drastic effects from AB5. So other industries were affected by this. A great example is think about your app driving businesses. So Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, all of them drastically affected. They actually immediately pushed another proposition, which they were able to pass, called Proposition 22. And it kind of was a little bit of an agreement. So their employees, well, they now have a little bit of a different relationship, but the drivers got some benefits associated with being an employee, but not all of those benefits. It was a little bit weird. We can expect a similar proposition to potentially come to the trucking industry, but it's going to have to be so different that it's going to be very challenging. So what we need to do as just a supply chain group is we really need to focus on this, because we should expect a change before the end of the year to what's going on. I mean, we're about to enter peak season. Now, if you're shipping out of California, you will be paying more, unfortunately. And, the fact that this is coming at a time when, obviously as we've been discussing, the Trans-Pacific rates have been going down, but this is also at a time when we're paying exorbitant amounts compared to what we were paying in 2019. So really, really, really challenging time for that. Now, I'm going to switch gears. I want to give you a quick shot of some things that we're focused on in the market, because, AB5 is really important. It's happening right now. We're going to have to talk about it probably at least on a bi-weekly basis, if not a weekly basis. But a couple things that we're noticing happening in the market that likely will affect you, particularly if you're shipping internationally, is, as follows. So right now, we've got the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Next month, they're going to begin hitting ocean carriers with a per container fee for export boxes that dwell too long at the port. So it's going to be $100 per container, and it's going to essentially be applied if these carriers don't remove at least 10% of the containers they dropped during the previous quarter. Keep that in mind. Switching to trucking. So daily LTL tonnage and shipments were up both 2.8%. And this is when you're looking specifically at data from Old Dominion Freight Line. And that was in the second quarter, year over year. And shipments increased 1.7% from the first quarter. Now, if you take a look, though, at total revenue, this is where it's crazy. So total revenue shot up by a ridiculous 26.4% year over year. And that is bringing them to a 1.7 billion year over year in the second quarter. So quite surprising. Now let's look over to international with a little bit of some interesting news. Hong Kong government figures, they're showing the number of container ships calling into their Kwai Chung container ports terminal. They fell by more than 21% to just 2,000 containers in the first quarter. Also, the figures show that the number of Hong Kong calls on Asia-Europe services dropped by 36%, along with a 22% drop in intra-Asia services. And then on the Trans-Pacific lane, calls were down 4.5%. So it's another thing to keep in mind. Railroads, they're having some drama at the moment as well. Currently, Union Pacific, they will not lift your container out of the stack, but they will charge you $1,900 per container in rail demurrage. And as you can imagine, cargo owners are a little frustrated. BNSF is allowing live lifts out of their Kansas City container stacks, but only if a trucking company brings their own chassis, and their process right now is a total mess. We've been having drivers that have had multiple hours trying to get a single container out. So keep in mind, it's an option, but it's not a great option. But coming back to UP, Union Pacific they prohibit truckers from bringing their own chassis to get containers out of the stack. And instead, the railroad requires importers to wait until the container's mounted on a pool chassis. And this we've seen to take literally days to weeks. So it can be a very, very difficult situation. And the whole time, UP is assessing demurrage. So it is, it's a very challenging situation. Okay, so overview of AB5 and some quick things that we're focused on right now in the shipping market. Likely what I'd like to do in weeks coming with our little FMR shot, I want to give you, I'd like to focus on air rates. It's kind of challenging to look at ocean rates because averages kind of take a few weeks to really settle. Air rates, though, I think a good snapshot is always helpful. And we'd like to keep up some of those, quick shot facts. AB5, I have to tell you, going through those cases and kind of bringing this to you today, it is really fascinating, and it is such a contentious issue, which you see through all of these cases. And you really can tell that California they're heading a direction, but this is a pretty forward move, and there's a lot of consequences. I mean, this is affecting, even if you look at like writers and just other industries all over the board that are getting affected by this. And so there's been a substantial amount of, legal action that's happening. So, unfortunately, this just hit the trucking market. You will be affected by this in the short term. We can only hope that we can kind of have a proposition get pushed through to make this a little bit more of a right fit statute to the trucking industry, because right now it doesn't feel like it's a good fit. All right, Vanessa, you want to dive into some questions?
Yes, I do. I have a question from Christy. I did send her a note with something that might be the answer. If it's not, I just told her I would ask you anyways. And if it's something we are not aware of at this point, we can connect her with Danny, who leads our West Coast domestic team. But here is her question. Jason, okay, going out on a limb here. Could the independent carrier bill/invoice the end user customer directly? And then the end user pay a percentage fee to the broker they're using, like we were paying the broker commission almost. Would that be one workaround all this nonsense? So the independent carrier bill the end user customer directly.
Essentially, you have like a management fee going to the broker, but the actual freight bill is going to, it's going between both businesses. Oh, that's fascinating. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. That's a great question. I love the out of the box thinking on that one too. Vanessa, can you take that down so I can have a discussion with Danny about that? Because I love that one.
I will connect the three of you. But yeah, let me see. I don't see any other questions right now. She did say thank you. So yeah, I'll connect the three of you. Christy, right after this call, you'll be seeing an email coming from me. And let me see. Nope, that was her. Yep. I think we are done. Jason, that's a lot of information. It can be confusing. So everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to email Jason after you digest everything. And thank you so much for your time. I'll see you next week. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. And one quick final note before we go, Vanessa, maybe you and me can get together and we can put a quick kind of ABC test pamphlet out so people understand that. I noticed that you put that also in there. And we can also include that initial 11 steps, because really it's both. You're either affected by one or the other. There's a list of included industries, and it's a long list, and definitely didn't want to read those off on this. But if I can get a nice, accurate, complete list of included, I'll try to send that out as well. But for a minimum, expect to get the breakdowns of how the courts are going to say, hey, you're doing this right or you're doing this wrong.
Perfect. I'll send it out with the recording. I'm going to call it tomorrow.
That sounds good. It's
Cool.
a busy week.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye.